Welcome back to another episode of the CSKA podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either an episode with a guest or multiple guests or a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education. In this week's particular episode, I'm interviewing Monica McGill, and we discuss the nuances of identities in relation to conversations around equity, the importance of having multiple pathways in CS, designing games for purposes beyond pure entertainment, co-developing CS courses with students, how researchers and K-12 practitioners can use CSEdResearch.org, which I do highly recommend checking out, our thoughts on bridging the gap between research and practice, opportunities for the field to continue to grow, the influence of outside forces on K-12 education, and so much more. As always, the show notes include links to more resources related to this particular episode. You can find that at jaredoleary.com or by simply clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on. In addition to the resources and all the podcast episodes on my website, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of free resources related to computer science education on my website, including a link to bootuppd.org, which is the nonprofit that I work for, where I create 100% free elementary coding curriculum. So make sure you check that out if you haven't. But with all that being said, we will now begin with an introduction by Monica.
I'm the founder and CEO of the nonprofit organization CSEdResearch.org, and I'm also a parent of 3 adult children, 2 little furries, and the spouse of a really good guy.
So if you read a story about your journey in CS education, what would the titles of the chapters be?
So chapter 1 would be choosing my major, computer science or music. Chapter 2, providing code correctness at the National Computer Security Center. Chapter 3, becoming a contractor with Computer Sciences Corporation. Chapter 4, stepping out of the professional space to raise kids. Chapter 5, hey, how about teaching full-time while getting a doctorate as a single parent? Chapter 6, how about teaching full-time at a teaching college and doing lots of research because I'm curious and I want to make the world a better place? And chapter 7, no, let's just do research, do it well, and help make the world a better place that way.
I love the titles of those chapters. What are some of the interesting things that you've learned along the way in those chapters?
Well, there is no doubt that I'm still learning a lot every single day, which I think is a good thing. One of the things I've learned is that many of my core values were actually shaped as a kid. So the ideas around fairness and equity were part of my parents' beliefs, and then those beliefs may not always manifested in what they did. But for me, it was their impact, I think, and their perspectives that really shaped those thoughts that I have now. One is that I watched my mom struggle to go into the professional working world during a time where women still weren't doing that as much. And then another is that despite the fact that I have 2 brothers, my parents were very insistent that no matter what, I was going to get the same opportunities that they did. And this is a time where, in the news, the ongoing battle, one that I remember is that girls were, fighting for the right to actually be able to play sports in high schools and K through 8 as well. And the arguments against that were just, at that age, I thought that they were so stupid. But I think that had impacts on me too, that why can't girls play sports in school? Because that's why we're even asking this type of question.
Yeah, and what's the equivalent type of questions that we're asking today?
Yes, there are so many, and the same types of arguments. And the people who now, would have their girls in sports in K through 12, they're making arguments about other ways that we need to work to keep people in their place.
Yeah, it's really interesting, the overall discourse and how it shifts. We do make progress over time, but it's a struggle to get there. And it takes sometimes decades before the thing that we're fighting for just becomes commonplace.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not sure that we always have to have these types of struggles, but I also understand that other people were raised differently than I was. So, they have their own experiences that they're coming from. I don't always understand their perspective, but I also feel like I want change to happen quicker in many ways.
Right. If we were to zoom in on that topic and specifically think about it in relation to computer science, what do you think as a field we are struggling with to discuss or explore or understand?
In what context?
So I guess what are some of the debates in the field that we're having that we don't really have an understanding of, whether it's in relation to equity or something else? So if we were to go the equity route, we think of the K-Poor Center's report that they had on the national survey of CS teachers. There's 40% of CS educators don't think we should discuss equity in the CS classroom. So that might be a potential topic to zoom in on. Does that provide some context to what I was thinking?
Yeah, it does. I think that the word equity scares some people when really all we're talking about is making sure that all kids no matter their background, those kids that are in your classroom should be taught computer science in a way that is most effective for them. And I think, with a politically charged environment that we're in right now too, that term equity, just using that, we just have to be careful with that. I just had pushback on something that we produced for somebody a few weeks ago, and I was surprised that they thought we focused too much on equity. My question is, why are you not focusing on equity? Because the students that you're trying to serve are very, very diverse. And if you're not considering that in all aspects of your curriculum development, how you deliver it, how it's received by the students, and really considering how it's received by the students, then that's a real problem.
Yeah, there's also this tendency, whether it be in curricula or discourse, for people to kind of essentialize and group and say, oh, well, you are of a particular identity, therefore you're going to like this particular aspect of CS education. And so we create these like many flavors of it, but it's like, hey, but there's the intersection of those. And then there's also, just because I am this identity doesn't mean I'm like somebody else who has that identity as well. There's much more nuances than just that.
Yeah. And that's really interesting when you brought that up, because I think about this often too, which is more recently, this idea of gender and what it means. And, I've been driven to look at gender because of the lack of women in tech. Mm-hmm. And how it's impacted me in both industry and also in academia. And I think that I'm very, very glad that the K through 12 students are more accepting and they're being raised more in an environment where things aren't always just masculine or feminine, traditionally masculine or feminine, and who belongs in those groups. Mm-hmm. And I do wonder, just thinking of more recently, that maybe that's not the question we should be asking, because what are we missing when quote unquote, traditionally female or feminine values or ideas or likes and dislikes are incorporated into a curriculum or incorporated into tech? Because we know that traditionally, a man may have some of those tendencies and vice versa. So maybe the question isn't really about gender itself, but really the personalities and the characteristics and the likes and dislikes of that individual person, and leaving those labels. Yeah, maybe right now in 2021, they're still more grouped by gender, but 10 years from now, we don't know what that's going to look like. And if we don't really focus on the underlying personalities and characteristics and likes and dislikes of people, of students, then how are we going to know 10 years from now? It's going to be so much harder to disaggregate just based on gender.
Right. Yeah. And then myself being non-binary, like within the capital T trans umbrella, like there's so many different variants of it, whether you're gender fluid, gender queer, or trans masculine, trans feminine, etc. Like when you throw that into the mix, then that just really like disrupts everything else that has been talked about for many years in CS. But one of the problems with it is like, even in the collection of data in the K-12 space in particular, is it's presented as this binary. So then what happens about that 1 or 2% of people who identify outside of that? And then what about like females who tend to do more masculine things and males who tend to do more feminine things, but they identify as male or female, etc.? Like there's so many more nuances to it. I wish we had a better system for actually getting into individual interests rather than just going with groups and saying, oh, well, you are this identity, therefore you're going to feel this way or like this thing.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. I hope this is a turning point. I love the idea that people can express who they are, not necessarily based on cultural expectations, but based on who they are. And I just think that as researchers, we really need to start thinking about what does that mean for research if we're just classifying people a certain way.
Yeah. If we were to look at the K-12 space and you were to design like an ideal version of CS education, specifically for people who wanted to eventually major in computer science, what do you think that would look like, that pathway?
I think that is a good segue from what we were just talking about as well. I don't think that for me alone to design that, I couldn't do that. I think that, especially as a white woman who was raised and grew up in in a different culture, right? I would need lots of voices at the table with me to actually design that in a way that would be effective for all sorts of different kids. And I think the other thing with that is we have to be careful about shaping K through 12 for just students to go in and be CS majors. One, because CS is going into every field. It really won't matter. It'll be like math and writing, right? Even at the college level. But also there's a whole other side of that, which is to look beyond occupations for K through 12 learners and what do they really need to know about technology. It's not just about programming and algorithms and how they work, but the good things of what it can do. And we also have to talk about the realistic aspect of that, of what the harms are going to be to people as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer. My follow-up question was going to be, okay, so how would that compare and contrast for like students who knew for a fact they weren't going to go into CS for a major and like didn't want to do that? It's like one of the things I talk about frequently on here is I proposed my wife by modding the video game Minecraft. So I learned Java and Eclipse IDE and I changed the game, added in all sorts of stuff that I knew that she would love, and then I proposed to her through the mod that I made. Like that was not at all related to a career. Yes, I could have gone into a career in that, but I just wanted to propose to my wife. And like that's an example of like a fun thing that you can do just in your leisure, and you don't have to necessarily head that direction for a career. So I think it's important for CS educators to really consider this because we are the exception in that we went into this field because it resonated with us in some way. And we can't necessarily expect that it's going to resonate with everybody in the same way.
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think the point that you're making too about something else drove you or helped you, right? Realize that it was something that you're interested in. That same concept can be used with children as well.
Yeah. So the last district that I was in was a K-8 district. And the kids had like grade 4 and above, they had several different languages to choose from. So they could have done Swift and worked on either Xcode or Swift Playgrounds. They could have done Ruby and Sonic Pi to code music. They could have done JavaScript with Khan Academy to create like art and animation, or they could have done Scratch to create like games and stories and whatnot. And one of the reasons why I almost every semester kept like adding in new languages was because there were groups of students who were like, hey, I'm really interested in whatever it was, but the current set of languages and platforms don't really allow me to do that. I want to explore this more. So I would expand the platforms to allow them to do that. Because there were some kids who were like, I love making music, but Scratch is very limited on the kinds of music that you can make. So it was like, great, let's do Sonic Pi. That gives you some more opportunities and whatnot. So I was trying to match the platform and the language to what the kids actually wanted to explore in the class.
I think that's a fantastic idea. And I think that you really have to consider what your students actually want. And also then coupling with that, the objectives that you want them to learn for that part of the day or curriculum.
So one of the things that I thought was really cool about your background is like you have experience with like game design, computer science, etc. Like those sometimes are two different things. Like you might get into like an after school club where like all I'm doing is designing games and you're like setting up parameters, but not necessarily actually engaging in the CS side of things. Like you might be building a world. You might be like animating the characters, but you're not really diving into the programming behind it, etc. I'm curious what you wish more like CS educators kind of understood about teaching CS through game design.
So first of all, I would say that it's really fun and engaging. It's engaging for the kids. It's more engaging for the teachers. It's definitely student-centered, not teacher-centered. Well, I guess it could be teacher-centered as well, depending on how you set up the parameters around what they're actually creating. So it can take so many different forms, and there's so many different aspects of learning that are incorporated into games, especially if it's a collaboratively designed and developed game.
What about game design outside of games purely for entertainment? So when I was looking at your background, you had some really cool games that weren't necessarily games for the sake of playing a video game.
Yeah, that's a good question. And from teaching for so many years, like 7 or 8 years in the game design area, I definitely came to understood that all games are play and all games teach us something. So even if it's quote unquote entertaining versus quote unquote a serious game, which I really don't like that term, but it's teaching us something. So, there's studies just on regular games where it's been shown to reduce anxiety of players, or it provides an escape from reality for a little bit. They're having, difficulties in their life or something, and it can shape our behavior. Just those games that we don't think that traditionally teach something, but they actually are. So I think if you look at that perspective, that all games teach us something, those things that are taught can be explicitly laid out or just in the background. So if you explicitly start to lay things out, you need to incorporate those things somehow in the game mechanics, but that shouldn't take away from the play. It shouldn't take away from the fun factor, because ultimately games light up something in our brain. We keep going back to them because they light up something in our brain. This is why animals play as well, right? You can see an animal. We were just talking about dogs, right? So our dogs will pick up a ball and they'll play, or they'll flip something around, or they'll chase each other around the table, or whatever the case is. And they're playing because it lights up something in their brain. So the same aspects are true for game design and development, that you're still trying to get that piece of brain to light up. And then you're just putting in, oh, by the way, this character has diabetes, and he or she or they start to eat more of the junk food. Bad things happens to little Coco the monkey in our case. So it's teaching in a subtle way, but very, very fun way, that the behaviors that we want the player to adapt are actually coming out through the play.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. My wife is also a gamer, and she's a therapist. And one of the things that she has looked into is some scholarship on games that are intentionally designed to improve mental and physical health and whatnot. And it's fascinating research, the things that people are exploring.
There's a lot out there. That's kind of why I shy away from the term serious games, because it's just really games that teach something else other than just, teaching us A, it's teaching us B, C, and D, for example.
If we were to use video games as a model or as a metaphor, how has it kind of informed your own approach to either curriculum or experience design, lesson or a class? And I ask this because some people have gone the gamification route, others have gone more of a metaphor for exploring a world or exploring a domain, etc.
So I have an interesting story to tell about this, because I actually took one of my theory classes in our game design curriculum and made it a game. There was no syllabus. It was a game handbook. There were many different things that the players, the students could choose. So all of it was written in the aspect of play. And as an experiment, I ran this, I think 2 semesters before I actually left that department. But there was pushback from students. And one of the things that, some students really excelled, because it was very open, even though you had to do certain things, right? You had to go a certain path, and to get to place X, right? Do your exploratory work, you would have to do these certain things. So many of these things didn't have deadlines. They were when you wanted to do them, and some of them did. So it was a combination. But basically, you had to rack up, I think, 27,000 points out of 33,000 to get an A, if you will. And I was really surprised that some students just were so uncomfortable with that. And what I observed and also talked to them about, that the K through 12 experience in the US has set them up for a certain paradigm for learning. And when they get into college, then to break that paradigm is a little bit mind-blowing for them. And it was really a shame, right? Because even though they were all into games and they loved playing games and they loved making games, here this learning opportunity was presented in a game, and they're like, no, we don't want this. So it was very, very eye-opening for me to put this in perspective of how we actually train students to behave in classrooms and in education. And then shifting that is just not really feasible to do at the undergraduate level.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It sounds a lot like an interview that I did with John Stapleton. So he loves playing tabletop role-playing games. And so Dungeons and Dragons, the idea of being a guild master, a dungeon master, and having it so that you are co-developing the world with students as they explore, and you are kind of creating some rules and parameters to work through, but they ultimately choose their own path and whatnot. You might have some different landmarks that people can see, and they might go to it, or they might explore a different uncharted territory, etc. And the kind of support that you have to provide, even in the K-12 space with students like this, it's really interesting. Like what I was saying with my class being able to pick different languages, if there were 30 kids in the class, there would be 30 different projects because they could go in any direction they wanted to. And for some students, that was very uncomfortable, even the younger kids, like in the primary grades, because they weren't used to that. They were taught for years, here's the thing I need to get an A. And I would sometimes have the middle school kids in particular be like, hey, what do I have to do to get an A in this class? And I'm like, well, one, I hope you never ask that question again, because the thing you got to do is just explore what you're interested in, and I'll help you along the way, etc. But it was foreign to them at that level. And it's honestly, with my experience, not until doctoral studies when I was finally asked, what do you want to study? And what I didn't understand is why it took like decades to get to the point where I finally was asked, okay, how do you want to develop your own expertise? And I think that's something that should be done from pre-K all the way up rather than waiting until the very end.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why when I answered that question too, I used undergraduate because right post-undergraduate, you may be in a position where you're doing your master's or PhD where you can actually choose that path of learning. Yeah. So I understand the reason for the patterns that are being developed in K through 12, but I also understand that maybe it's time to revisit those a little bit too.
If you were to wave a magic wand, what's one kind of change that you might make in that area?
I haven't thought about this as much because I've been focusing on different things. When I went through this process and had this experience with the students, it really taught me something about these patterns that they've been locked into for so many years. I think that there's always a balance between making sure that you teach them what needs to be taught and also providing them a way to do that is interesting for them. I'm not quite sure. What may work well in one setting may not work in another setting. So I think it's all individual to that particular classroom. So yeah, that's something that I haven't really spent too much time on. It's definitely an interesting problem though to think about.
Yeah, I like to think of like broad hypotheticals, but also actionable things. There's a tendency to focus on too much of the vision without action behind the vision, especially in relation to equity. We talk a lot, but we don't necessarily get much done in that area, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely.
So thinking about your journey and where you are now with focusing on research, I'm curious if somebody had never heard of CSEdResearch.org, how would you describe it to them? Like, what is CSEdResearch.org?
So CSEdResearch.org is a 501c3 nonprofit organization here in the US. And our mission is to improve K-12 education for all children by enabling and disseminating exemplary, evidence-driven research that supports all learners. So that's part of our mission statement. And what that really means is that we look at ways in which we can produce high quality, equity focused education research for K-12 CS education that will enable teachers to actually put into practice ways in which are most effective for their particular students to learn. But we're also focused on enabling the researchers to do the same. So we're a novice field. We have new researchers coming into the fields. There are 55 million children in the US alone who will eventually likely have CS education starting in kindergarten, but there's so much we don't know. And there's just so much research that needs to be done that as a novice field, we're starting to grow, but the need is going to be great for education research in the future. So one thing I want to add is that CSEdResearch.org actually originated from an NSF grant. It's a long way to this where we are today, but I had an NSF grant with my research partner, Adrian Decker, and we received that grant in 2016. And what it was supposed to be was more focused on informal education, but as people may know, in 2016, that's when the Obama administration came out and said, basically CS for everybody. And that was a path that they were going to start to work towards. So that changed a little bit the trajectory of our research. We started looking at K through formal curriculum as well. And as part of that, we took what we were investigating and put it on the website. So the survey instruments to actually measure whether or not classroom practices were effective, and then the actual research articles that had been written on K-12 CS education. So we've decided to share that with everybody in the form of our website, and we named the website CSEdResearch.org. So then when I decided to leave academia and focus solely on research, I just went ahead and kept that name for the organization as well.
Yeah, I looked at a lot of the resources over the summer, and there were like frameworks or heuristics to kind of think through, hey, if you're going to be studying CS education, like if you're going to start an RPP or something, here's some things to think through or some questions to consider. I think if anyone hasn't checked it out and they're interested in CS education research, they definitely should visit it. What about for K-12 educators?
The educators, we're working on a few things. One of the things that we're working on right now actually is, and when I say we have 3 full-time staff members right now and 1 part-time person. So we're small, but we're definitely growing. And we are working on a project that looks at problems of practice that teachers experience. We're working with Michelle Friend at University of Nebraska, Omaha, and we're looking at putting those problems of practice on our website. So we have this compendium of over 400 responses from across the world, mostly in the US, though. We're going to share those with everybody, and then teachers can come and upvote or downvote the problems of practice that they're experiencing. So we're trying to fill that gap between practice and research by sharing with researchers what practitioners mostly want answered. And then likewise, we're looking at ways in which we can bring the research more closely to teachers. And we've had other projects where this was with the Computer Science Teachers Association, where we worked with just a very small set of teachers and we brought researchers in and they discussed research and they developed teacher practice briefs for other teachers based on certain topics that were equity focused. And that was really a cool experience as well. So we're hoping to scale that up in the future, but that's kind of that space where we're trying to make sure that the research is useful to practitioners as much as possible. And the practitioners have a voice in that research as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. One of the reasons why I tend to alternate between like an interview with a guest or multiple guests and then like a solo episode where I unpack scholarship is because there is that disconnect where like academics talk to academics, K-12 practitioners talk to K-12 practitioners, and they don't really share, well, here's what I'm struggling with, or here's what we understand based on research, etc. So I like to kind of bridge that gap with those episodes. But then there's also the question that I like to ask guests that I'll just go ahead and ask you right now is like, what do you wish there was more research on that could inform your own practices?
I need more time, really. I'm not going to get that, but I wish I had more time to actually read more about what other people are writing and what are the research that they're conducting, as well as ways in which to conduct the research, like the whole open research movement, pre-registration of studies. All that is very, very interesting to me, but I often don't have the time to actually take a deep dive into it like I would like to. So I'm not sure beyond that.
Yeah, it'd be interesting if more researchers actually like shared podcasts of themselves talking about a publication.
Yeah, so I'll just bank off of that too. So that is true. And I think that there are many ways that we think traditionally sharing research in publication venues like conferences and journals helps get the word out to other researchers. It sure would be nice if all of them required a like key takeaway section.
Yeah.
That could be boxed out that people could go directly to who need that information. So not just teachers, but practitioners in general in K through 12. So whether it's, superintendents at the state level or curriculum designers at the district level, that they could quickly thumb through it and get those key takeaways. I know we have lots of limitations around stuff, but that would be really useful. I think more meta-analysis is useful as well, so that instead of having 40 papers that someone has to read that may not read it, for example, a curriculum designer at the K-12 level, they could actually go to one paper that summarizes, 40 or 50 papers. And that I think would be very meaningful. And it is meaningful. I've seen them out there. So as we grow as a field, as our quality of research improves, I'm hoping that there are going to be more high quality meta studies as well that help us pinpoint what those best practices, or at least most promising practices, are for teachers.
Yeah, I like that. My mention of the podcast is like, I had a publication come out in a handbook earlier this year and I wrote it 3 years ago. So like it took that long between like first copy submission to actual print copy in hand. Like it shouldn't take that long. But then even just like what you're saying, it's hard to stay up to date on everything, but it's easier to listen to podcasts while you're like driving to and from a location. Like if people were to actually just share, here's a little summary of this particular article that I wrote, and if it's an audio form, that makes it a whole lot easier to digest.
Yeah, we have to bring the research to where the people are, not force the people to come where the research is. So I think podcasts are good. Social media is good. Even TikTok, I think that exploring that, lots of teachers are out on TikTok, right? So how do we get them that information that they need in tiny, tiny chunks that they'll learn from and hopefully adapt as classroom practices?
Yeah, especially considering that a lot of research is behind a paywall. Like that could help democratize things and make it easier to access.
Yes, absolutely.
Generally speaking, how do you practice or iterate on your own abilities? Like whether it's in research or in education or CS?
Well, I'm not teaching anymore. So I've been focusing mainly on research and then also growing the organization, which requires a different set of skill sets. So some of my time has been learning more about nonprofit organizations and how they run. And the other part is often conducting the research. So I try to build into the research my time to actually look at other people's research and other best practices that are going on for research so that I can make sure that my research and our team's research is where it needs to be.
Yeah, I really like that. That's something that I have kind of forced myself to do with the podcast by like doing those unpacking scholarship episodes where I look at other scholarship. It's forcing me to think through and read other people's material so that can inform the research that I am doing. So that definitely resonates with me.
I think that this also brings up the idea of doing interesting qualitative studies because you can actually talk to people and really learn what's going on with them, right? Not just a number, but actually behind the numbers and see what they're interested in learning, what they need to know for their jobs and teaching their kids, what kind of kids that they have, all those situations that we don't really know as well because we're not in the K-12 classroom. And some of us have never been in the K-12 classroom. So, as researchers, how do we really start to understand what is happening on the ground? I think that's a really important thing to really focus on.
How do you prevent the burnout that can come with being a researcher in education space? Because there's always more to explore, especially when you're investigating equity related stuff. And that can get pretty heavy pretty quick, depending on what you're looking into. So like, how do you prevent that burnout that can come with it?
Well, for me personally, because I had just left academia. So for me, doing the research and the teaching, in my mind being more focused on the research, I feel like, and some academics may understand this, but I left academia, right, because I was working all the time. Interestingly enough, I was at a meeting this weekend, a virtual meeting, and there were physicians in the meeting, and one physician was explaining how someone else works. And he said that this person works like an academic because they're working all weekend. We're getting emails on the weekend. We're getting emails in the evening, and there's just no stopping. And, they wanted to care for this person to make sure that this person was taking time off and recouping and restoring themselves. So for me, leaving academia has been good for me personally, and it's allowing me the opportunity to do research. And I'm trying very hard to have times that I work and times that I don't work. And if I do work odd hours, I'm, scheduling messages so they go out at normal work time. So somebody else doesn't have to feel like they have to respond at 8:00 at night or on the weekend. There's a lot to do. And I try to focus on this aspect that we're just one tiny spoke in a wheel, a very, very, very huge wheel. And, if I can help other people on that same wheel do the work that they're trying to do and make that high quality, then, hopefully it's about sharing the opportunity to make things better for this next generation that's coming up.
Yeah, I appreciate that answer. Having gone to school with and been the kind of person who never stops working, like I have learned the value of setting aside time to rest. And that I had to learn the hard way. So for anyone else who is also that kind of individual, I do recommend taking a break. Like even if it's like at 5 p.m., I set an alarm and that's when I just shut my brain down from working on this thing and focus on family or whatever. It makes life a lot better.
Yeah, exactly. So we've also taken up hiking during the pandemic. One of the ways that my husband and I have been trying to get exercise while also not being able to go to the gym anymore or not going to the gym. I guess it is open now, but just to go out and enjoy nature and go hiking, take the dogs, all that good stuff.
Yeah, being in Phoenix, we actually have quite a bit of hiking opportunities around. It's pretty nice. So if anyone has mountains nearby or hills, I highly recommend hiking as well.
Yeah, definitely.
What about recommendations for like the overall improving equity and inclusion in CS?
I think, we touched on it earlier, but I think we need to really define and redefine who is included and who isn't, less based on maybe gender, race, and ethnicity, but actually taking into account the many different factors that influence whether or not a student wants to pursue computer science further along the line. in whatever it is, in high school or in college or other alternatives to college as well. I think that would be probably one of the things that I would like to promote, that redefinition. And then, looking at the research to really understand how that impacts those particular students as individuals, not necessarily all those other labels that we have to put on. We also have to recognize that our tech industry there is a dearth of still women and people of various races and ethnicities, disabilities, all of the things that have left them to be excluded from that field. So, it's kind of a fine line, but there's also, opportunity to grow, think about things a little bit differently, because in a white male oriented industry, for 10 or 15% of people to come in, they're going to adapt that culture that's already there. They're not going to be able to make the change. So, if we even look at the white males that are excluded from the tech industry and what characteristics they have, or personalities, or likes and dislikes, they may be a welcome addition into the tech industry in helping shape that culture as well. A different way to think of things, but I keep thinking about where we are and where we need to go and how little is changing right now still. And it's just a very, very slow change, as we discussed earlier as well, that maybe it is an opportunity for us to think about things a little bit differently.
Yeah, I like the way you framed that, especially if I think of like video game culture in particular, which is like a more narrow subset of like the broader CS culture. Like it's very much like a bro mentality. And from what I understand of people who go into the industry, is like you have to assimilate into that dominant culture. You're not, as somebody who might be underrepresented within that space, if you go in, they're not all of a sudden going to bend to what would be best for you and other people like you and who are outside of that dominant culture. So that's interesting to think through.
Yeah, exactly.
What's one thing that you're working on that you could use help with from a listener?
The one thing we're trying to do is to build this resource center on our website that is actually meaningful to other education researchers. So if anyone has thoughts or ideas about how we can improve that, if other researchers have certain needs that would help improve their own research, then we are definitely all ears. And you can either email us directly or use our contact us form on the website. We actually do get that. I do get that. And we'd be happy to include that in our future plans for the site as well.
What questions do you have for myself or for the field?
I'm curious where you think we'll be going in the next 5 to 10 years as a research field.
One of the things that I am very hopeful for is that we start focusing in on the micro rather than just the macro, whether that be like this very local school, here are their perspectives of CS implementation, whether it be creating a curriculum that matches specifically for them, or looking into more case studies of students going into it. There are some people who are exploring it, but not enough, in my opinion. I'm also thinking, like you were mentioning, we're going to start broadening beyond just like race, gender, ethnicity, like socioeconomic status. I think the next big area that we will hopefully focus on is disability. And what does that mean? Whether it's like physical impairment or cognitive or neurological, etc. Like there are many different avenues to explore with that. And I've talked about this in some other episodes that I'll include some links to in the show notes. But I'm hoping that as a field, we don't just talk about CS across the nation and like the broader umbrella of what CSEd looks like, but we start talking about, well, what variant or flavor are you going to use in your classroom in the community that you work in? And how is that going to be different from elsewhere? There's this tendency to take this like homogenous approach rather than a multi-perspectivalist approach with CS education, where it's like, oh, well, I, a teacher in rural Utah, am going to teach the exact same thing as somebody in Miami, Florida. Like, maybe, but maybe you shouldn't. It depends on the community and what they're interested in, etc. So I'm hoping 5 years from now, as a research field, we are focusing more on the micro, I guess, instead of just the macro.
Yeah, I would definitely concur with all of that.
If I were to flip that question onto you, would you have a similar or different answer? Or?
It's definitely in line with what I'm thinking as well. I know that one single study can't answer all the questions, but again, with that spoke, are we covering everything that we need to be covering? Disability is a huge area for growth. I think in our data set of 900 and some papers, maybe 3 to 4% actually even just ask or include as part of their demographics of their students whether or not any students had disabilities. So we're doing all these nice research studies, but without even capturing that information, which, okay, there's some issues around that as well, but without even trying to capture that information, then how do we know what's really working in classrooms where 10-15% of the students might have an IEP plan, which in the US is an individualized plan, often for students who have a disability or other behavioral issues. Yeah, I'm definitely right in the same frame that you are.
And the nice thing is there are people who are studying it, like Richard Ladner, Andreas Stefik, there's Maya Israel, Todd Lash, and they are supervising more graduate students who are then going to start supervising. So it's going to have that ripple effect of more people investigating it. So I'm hopeful 5 years from now it would be much more commonplace when describing participants, you actually discuss disabilities among your participants and whatnot.
Yeah. And the other area that's often overlooked too is emergent language learners. So those students who, are picking up a second, third language, and that language is English. How is this impacting them? Because there's some great tools out there for actually reaching students, and there's not enough, but there are some that are out there that a lot of teachers I know are struggling with as immigrants come into their more rural communities. When traditionally they may not have any before, and now all of a sudden they're having a number of them.
Yep.
And how do we make sure that those students are also able to learn computer science?
Yeah, so I did an interview with Sarah Vogel. It's not out at the time of this recording, but we discussed that more, like bilingualism in relation to CS education and some of the deficit language that's framed around it, and some of the even policies. Like here in Arizona, there might still be a policy that it was illegal to speak any language other than English unless you were teaching a foreign language class. So I had classes with 35 kindergartners where none of them spoke English as their primary language, and it was illegal for myself or their kindergarten teacher to speak Spanish to them. So it's just we're trying to help these kids, and you're putting these policies in place, likely well-intentioned, but they are really problematic for a variety of reasons. Are there any questions or topics that you'd like to discuss that I haven't brought up?
I think one that we haven't really talked about too much is the concept of all students needing to learn, not just for fulfilling jobs in industry, which is important, or for the government, for example, for cybersecurity, in the area of cybersecurity, which is definitely important. We definitely need people in those fields to protect all of us, is the concept of the flip side of technology, right? So going back to Neil Postman, who I really enjoy reading his work, where whenever technology is brought into a society, people are going to benefit from it and other people are going to be harmed from it. Of course, there may not be any impact on people, but technology itself really isn't neutral. And, I think introducing play is great for students, especially in the early grades, but somehow in the later grades, we really need to shift to a point where we're actually talking about the harms of technology and what that means to society and, that individual student, but also the communities that they live in and society in general. So I think that over the last few years, we're seeing more and more of the harms come out, and industries kind to try to downplay that because we're in an uber capitalistic society right now. And so what do they want? They don't want those problems. We just want to make money, and I don't want to address that.
Yep.
I think those issues are going to be really, really critical over the next 10 years, especially as we look at, in a politically charged environment, who's starting to gain control of the media outlets, who has understanding of algorithms and how to tweak those to make them benefit their own ideas. It is very worrying. And, I know I'm not the only one. There are a lot of people who are concerned about that. However much it's going to impact us as adults, it's going to impact the kids even more.
Yeah, I really appreciate that response. I think we are starting to talk about that more in the K-12 space, like the bias that happens in AI or in programming or whatever. But I hope we also start to think more broadly in terms of, okay, well, what is the potential impact of this on the environment? What is the potential impact of, if I were to create this thing, a device, how it's manufactured? What are the working conditions of the people who manufacture this? What about the working conditions of the people who mine the precious metals that are then used to create the parts that are then assembled, etc.? Looking more broadly at than just how algorithms are biased, but also thinking of, okay, the physical devices, etc. Like, we'll see if that's more of part of the discussion 10 years from now or not.
I sure hope so. I'm very concerned. I mean, I think this is an area where if change doesn't happen faster than change in other regards, then, and not having the change is going to benefit a lot of people, right? Not having that change, and there's going to be a struggle to make sure that change happens, is definitely very worrying.
Yeah, and this is where it's like, if you want to leave out politics in education, that's going to have really bad impact down the road if we don't talk about these things, because we need to start solving these problems now, and especially addressing this with the future leaders, because no offense to anyone in Congress and whatnot, but our current leaders aren't really discussing it enough. So we need to do something more long-term.
Yeah, well, we don't have a lobby group for fairness in AI. Well, maybe there is, but it's not as predominant as the industry lobbying groups. And at least here in the US, I don't know elsewhere, but when it gets to the point where whether or not we're going to be a democracy and whether any longer, right, then I think that there's a huge time to really step back and think about how we got here and what technology contributed to that. But also, and I include myself in this, failures, educators, particularly at the post-secondary level, who have not talked about these implications of what we're teaching our students in the classroom.
Yeah. Many snaps to that answer. So where might people go to connect with you and the organizations that you work with?
So a couple places. One is you can go to our website. Like I mentioned earlier, you can go to the contact form and reach out to us. That's probably the easiest. You can also reach me directly at monica@CSEdResearch.org with your thoughts, or if you have ideas that you want to share with us, or potential projects that you would like us to offer advice on or help out on. And we're also hopefully going to start going to more in-person events. So you can always catch us at, we're trying to get to SIGSE. All three of our full-time staff will hopefully be at SIGSE. So you can reach out to us there as well.
And with that, that concludes this week's episode of the CSK8 podcast. Again, the show notes at jaredoleary.com include links to various resources mentioned throughout this particular episode, and over 100 more podcast episodes that are relevant to computer science educators and scholars. Speaking of, if you're a scholar and you're interested in potentially working on a grant together, please contact me using the button on my website. Happy to engage in a conversation and collaborate on future research together. And if you enjoyed this particular episode, please consider sharing or leaving a review on whatever platform you're listening to this on. It'll help more people find it. Thank you so much for listening. Stay tuned next week for another episode. And until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.